Welcome, everyone, to Latter Daily Digest. We honor creators, and today we have the author of a brand new book. It's actually out in PDF form right now, but it's going to be out in print starting July 1st. And we're welcome to have on the show Matt Harris. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, you guys.
And Summer, the lovely Summer Rain, is joining me today. Thank you, Summer,
Very
for
excited to be
coming
here
on the show. Matt, give us a little background on where you were born, what songs your mom sang to you. No, not that, just the other stuff.
She still sings them, Gene.
Just call her up, right?
Come on, Mom. I've heard this before. But I'm a professor of history at Colorado State University in Southern Colorado, and been here since 2005, working backwards for a moment. Mm-hmm. And I taught at Dixie State University in Southern Utah prior to coming here. So I did my graduate work at Syracuse University, received 2 degrees there, a master's of philosophy and a PhD, both in history. And then before that, I was at BYU, and I received a bachelor's and another master's degree, both in history and political philosophy. My specialties are American history, but within American history, I do civil rights, legal history, constitutional history. I teach courses on race and religion, and religion and politics, all the non-controversial stuff.
All the non-controversial, the boring parts of history.
Oh,
right?
Man, it's an election year. It's something else, I'll tell you. And let's see, I grew up in Maine, so I'm an East Coast guy. And if I had a crystal ball that suggested when I was a young kid that I would be living in Southern Colorado, I would have told you were nuts. I was growing up, I didn't know what a sprinkler system was. Nobody had sprinkler systems because we had enough moisture where we didn't need it.
Yep.
So I grew up in Maine, and I served an LDS church mission to Idaho in the late 80s, early 90s, dating myself here, and had a lovely.
So you speak Idahoan. You've learned that language.
I do. I learned how to speak with potatoes in my mouth. And just a quick story about that. So Maine, back in the day, I don't know where they're at today in terms of spud output, but Maine was a big producer of potatoes. And of course, Idaho, big russet potatoes that those of us who like potatoes. So anyway, I got to first day on my mission, or first week there, we were in church, and one of the brothers in the ward looked at me and he said, "Where are you from?" This is an Idaho farm guy, right? And I said, "I'm from the real potato state." And then their heads just kind of jerk around in the pew, and they stare at me, and they said, "He's from Idaho." And then another guy pops up. "He can't be from Idaho and be serving here too. Where are you from?" And I told them Maine, and they said, "Oh, those little red potatoes. Those are nothing."
Wow.
Yeah, those are just potato snacks.
Those are just little treats.
That reminds me, like in South America, they're famous for their specialty type potatoes in like Peru and other Bolivia and stuff like that, I think. And so yeah, there's more than one potato out there.
It's true. It's true. I like them both. So I'm not.
That's right. They each have their own spot on the table.
That's right. So anyway, I was in Idaho, and I served my mission there and really enjoyed it. It was my first time up close and personal with a large concentration of Latter-day Saints. And you can imagine that the church in Maine is not huge. What I learned from my mission was something interesting. I learned a couple things. I better know my faith pretty well. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard to talk to people who know Mormonism really well because they grew up with it. And if they weren't LDS, they still knew about the church because their neighbors had just hounded them over the years.
Yeah.
And so, it's a truism that whenever you have a high concentration of Mormons, there's always a strong counterculture. And we see that in Salt Lake. We see it in Pocatello, Idaho. We see it everywhere. And so I ran up against that counterculture where people who were really angry and bitter towards the church, the film Godmakers was still popular in Idaho, if you guys know that film from the 80s. And so some of the folks in Idaho were watching the Godmakers, and they would have us in missionaries, and they would just want to hound us over the Godmakers. And I hadn't seen it. I knew a little bit about it, but I hadn't seen it. And so they were asking me all of these things about the God makers. And I remember as a 19-year-old kid who slept his way through early morning seminary, I thought, they never prepared us for this.
Oh, yeah.
So that was trial by fire. And I learned early on, after tracking into a professor at Idaho State, this is my first year, it was Pocatello. And I remember tracking to this young professor. He was probably late 20s, early 30s. He was a professor of archaeology, and he asked us a question about Book of Mormon archaeology. And I was just taken aback by it because, again, I never learned anything about this. I just knew the basics. And so I left that experience humiliated because he wasn't really trying to fight with us and stump us. He just asked basic questions that I felt embarrassed to not have good answers. And so from that point on in my mission, which would have been the next 23 months, I resolved to never have that happen again. So I dove into all kinds of church material from people, scholars in the church like Hugh Nibley and others that I respected at the time. And so I felt like when somebody asked a tough church question in the future, I could at least give a stab at a decent question or decent answer.
That's right.
Do you think that kind of led you to wanting to get into history overall, or did you always have an interest in history before your mission?
Yeah, no, I didn't. Our bishop and stake president, so he was bishop first and then stake president, and he was a chiropractor. So I played sports growing up, played basketball, big basketball family. And I remember going to the chiropractor, my bishop, for adjustments. And I was intrigued by, he was a cool guy. I really like him. And he was kind of sporty himself. And so I thought, I want to be a chiropractor. And so when I went to BYU, I wanted to study science, pre-med. And then I thought to myself, I don't know if I really like chemistry. And so I studied history because I enjoyed history, and I got off my mission, returned to my mission, and I wanted to be go to law school. And I remember preparing for the LSAT, the exam that one takes to go to law school. And at the 11th hour, I decided I didn't want to do this anymore. So I was supposed to take the test in, a month or two. I was prepping for it during one summer, and I changed my mind. And what I realized was I really enjoyed studying legal history and legal things and constitutional law, but I didn't want to practice it. And so that's when I decided I wanted to go into graduate work in history and still teach about the Constitution and legal history, but not have to do the day-to-day grind of representing somebody.
Wow, I love that.
Cool.
Yeah. But maybe another question is, how'd you get involved in Mormon history?
Yeah, that's the other question.
Was it because of all of Joseph Smith's constitutional problems? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Ooh. So when I went to BYU, after my mission, I felt that I was fairly informed, and you had to be in Idaho. If you went somewhere else in the world, that maybe not so much, right? If you're at a mission overseas, they may not know a lot about the church and all that stuff. But Idaho, they did. So they kept me on my toes. Thank you, Idaho. And I love the people of Idaho. They were really, really great people and gracious, and even people who didn't want to hear the message, I thought they were gracious. But so I got off my mission, and I kept my ear to the ground on Mormon things. I went to the BYU history department, and some of the church's finest historians were in that department. And they were very, very honest in the church's history, including its warts and flaws, but they are also practicing faithful Latter-day Saints. And so I saw that model in them. One of my teachers is still alive. I just saw him at a conference a couple of weeks ago. His name is Tom Alexander. He's probably in his early 90s. And I think he's epitomizes what a good scholar should look like, as, a person who believes in a person who's trying to represent the highest standards of one's craft. So I was trained in that, but again, I wanted to go to law school, so Mormon history wasn't my thing. And before I left and decided I wanted to go to a history graduate program, one of my professors pulled me aside and he said, man, I know you like Mormon history, we all do, but don't do it. It's like quicksand. Once you get in, you can't get out. And I thought, okay. But he also said something that was more practical. He said, besides, you'll never get a job if you specialize in more.
There we go.
And right? That's good advice. And so I went to graduate school to study early American history, which is where one of my doctoral fields lie. And my first job at Dixie State University, they hired me because I was an early Americanist. wasn't because I had some passing fancy in Mormon history. It probably
How early does early American history start for your doctorate?
Yeah, usually.
I mean, the Mayflower?
No. Indigenous contact. So Columbus, European exploration.
Wow.
Some programs may go back further, but yeah, no contact. It's indigenous contact with Columbus forward.
Right.
And the Mayflower stuff is just a little blip in the, that's unimportant for most scholars today. That's been mythologized a lot. Yeah. So anyway, so I did early American history in about 2011, 2012, after I did a book on the founding fathers and religion. And I did a book on Thomas Jefferson and the exploration of the American West. And those are two books that really represented my interest in early America. And then by 2011, 2012, I decided I wanted to look at my own faith tradition. And as a missionary, of course, any missionary will come across the church's race teachings. And I was never, ever comfortable with the race teachings. I remember in Pocatello, we had met this African-American man. His wife was a member, but he wasn't. And so she called us and wanted us to meet with him. And the church's position at the time was, we don't know why there is a ban. And that was always profoundly unsettling to me because, the church had answers for every important question, right? The purpose of life and the nature of families and all of these important theological questions. But yet nobody could seem to answer why the church's rituals, why the church denied Black and biracial people, millions of people over time, the church's most sacred rituals. And that bothered me. And I remember in Pocatello, one of my companions, we were talking about it. And I said to him, I don't really feel comfortable in this we don't know line. There's got to be an answer. And he said, yeah, I know the answer. And I got excited for a minute that my companion knew something that I didn't know. And so I know the answer, he says. And he goes over to our shelf and he pulls out Mormon doctrine. Oh, and it's right in
all
here.
The answers.
It's right in here, right? It's right in here. And
Bruce's Bible.
He read it, and I was familiar with the book. And so when he appealed to authority to answer my question, I kind of rolled my eyes thinking, I know what you're going to say. And I don't like that either.
Right.
There's got to be a deeper dive.
There's got to be more to it. And so that's what happened. And then as I finished my early American, I still teach early American, and I teach other things as well. But by 2011, 2012, I started to shift into Mormon history, which is where I am today. And most of my writings, not all, but most of my writings deal with race, right-wing extremism in the church, civil rights, race construction, lineage. And it's really interesting to me because it's my culture, it's my history, it's my family's history and culture. But also as a scholar, Mormon 20th century and 21st century Mormonism, which is what I do. I do some 19th century, but mostly I'm a modern guy. And it's amazing to me how the modern era, there's so many gaps. It hasn't been researched and explored and written about. And that's where I've moved in and, staked a hold that has served me well for over 10 years now.
Who was the first Mormon historian that you collaborated with?
Newell Bringhurst, the person you showed up a minute ago. Newell and I have been close friends for well over a decade. And when I did, when I was transitioning to Mormon studies, I was really a busy guy. I was the graduate director of our master's program. I was writing federal government grants. I had a young family. I had 2 book contracts that I had written proposals for, and they awarded me advanced contracts, which is really nice, and including this one here. And I thought to myself, I am never going to be able to finish this book with all the things that I'm doing unless I have help. So I called up Newell Bringhurst, my co-author, and I called him up, and he didn't know who I was, but I knew him from his writings. And he interviewed me. Who are you? What are you after? What are you doing? And which is fair, right? If you're going to accept a major assignment to be a co-author, which is a lot of work, you want to know what you're getting yourself into. And so we just struck up a friendship that day. And I said, I need some help with this book. I've already written the outline. It's been the contracts here, everything. I just need some help getting it over the finish line. And that's where he stepped in.
And where is he teaching at the time?
He had just retired from the College of Sequoias in Visalia, California.
Mm-hmm.
So he had some time. I caught him at a good moment.
Yeah.
And he's been writing about Mormons and race his entire adult life. So of all the people to invite to help me, he was really a great person. And he introduced me to a lot of people in the Mormon studies community, which to this day I really appreciate.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And you said that this project started about 15 years ago?
Just to be clear about something to your listeners, I mean, this is my second book. We're talking about this book today, Second Class Saints. But I did this first book, and we started probably 2011. It was published in 2015. And the difference between the two books are, I mean, night and day. But the first book was, what we wanted to do was look at the most authoritative documents on race and provide these in-depth contextual essays about the documents. Who wrote them? What did the documents say? What impact did it have on the church? Were they controversial? If so, how? And so that's what we did. And it's not just a list of documents. Really, some significant research went into it. And a couple things that are noteworthy with this book is that they sold this at Desert Book, which my father and I, who's my dad's been a bishop in the church, and we were in Salt Lake once, and he said, "Son, come here." We were just browsing in Desert Book, and he said, "They're selling your book." And I think he almost had to call 911 because it's not an easy book. I mean, it deals with racism. Yeah. And the fact that Desert Book was selling it obviously made my dad really happy. And of course, I had to bring him down to reality a little bit. Dad, yes, I'm happy they're selling it, but look at where they're selling it. It's around the corner in the darkest part of the room. And my dad, he goes up to the front to the register to, this nice lady. "This is my son's book." Thanks, Dad.
That's right. It should have a front end cap display.
Yeah. Can you get an end cap full of this book?
Number one fan.
Well, they sold it, and the reason why I'm shocked that they sold it, to this day I'm still shocked, is because in the introduction we write that the priesthood ban was a result of racism, not revelation. And right. That's an extraordinary statement. Yeah. And I give Desert Book props for doing that. And the BYU, I was just told this recently, that one of my friends on the BYU religion faculty, he told me that they use this book to redo their race curriculum.
Oh,
so they use it to sort of govern it. Yeah, I was really flattered to hear that.
And what year did it come out?
I think your work is doing some good. 2015.
Okay, so the essay on the race and the priesthood had already come out that the church had produced?
2013.
And do you know the people that worked on that?
Yep, I do.
Are you allowed to say anything about it?
Yeah, it's public knowledge now. If it wasn't public, I probably wouldn't have said anything. But Paul Reeve, University of Utah scholar, friend of mine, he wrote the first draft of the race and the priesthood. I think Paul is cautious to note that his was the first draft and not later iterations.
Yeah.
And the reason why he notes that, I think, is that as it went through the editing process, he just didn't like some of the changes that evolved and didn't really want to stake his name to it, since his draft did not represent necessarily the final draft. But anyway, he took a first draft at it, or first crack at it, and it was reviewed by Patrick Mason at Utah State University. He's the holder of an endowed chair in Mormon history. And both Paul and Patrick endorsed my Second Class Saints book, which I'm extremely grateful for.
They're right there. They're on the back there, which is awesome.
Yes, they're both wonderful human beings. And they're like Tom Alexander. I think they represent the finest scholar disciple model there is in the church. Yeah. And let's see, Darius Gray, my friend Darius Gray, read an early draft. And also my late friend Armin Moss. So those four guys read an early draft of the race and the priesthood essay.
I believe I met Darius Gray around 2010. He was part of a group that presented at the Oakland Interstate Center, and there's also a visitor center there as well. But it was just in a little chapel building up on the temple grounds. And it was the first time I ever heard that there was an African American in the 1800s that held the Melchizedek priesthood. And I was like, wow, I have been through 40 years of Sunday school, and why haven't I ever heard of that before? So anyway, they presented a different type of history, and it made me start thinking, and that actually was the start of me actually figuring out that there was more to Mormon history as well. But I just have like a very amateur, 10-foot pole kind of interest. My first Mormon History Association was in 2022, where I met you actually the first time. And after you gave a presentation, we were on a panel with 3 other people, and I can't remember exactly what it was. But anyhow, that was exciting to find out that there was more to it.
Oh, there's so much more, Gene.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I don't want to be critical, but I'm always amused when I come across Latter-day Saints who think that they're informed in church history, in theology. And for me as an academic, I'm always interested, what are you reading? What are you learning? I just read the latest book from Desert Book, and I'm not here to knock on Desert Book, but Desert Book is a devotional press, right? Their main motive is to bring people to Christ, to give you a warm fuzzy after you read one of their books, which is, again, why I'm a little shocked that they sold this, because it's not, it's a work of scholarship. I don't write warm fuzzies, nor do I write books that are critical of the church. I just write scholarship. I don't have faith commitments in mind when I write my work. And people will see in this book here that there are some definite heroes in this book, right? I didn't start out making them heroes, but it turns out that they are for the good work that they did lifting the band. But when I talk to Latter-day Saints, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I'm informed. I read the Ensign and I read Desert Book," and I'm thinking to myself, there's a difference between devotional work and scholarship. If you really, really want to know church history, you've got to read scholarship. And some of the general authorities, I get asked this often, do they know all this stuff? Well, no. Why would they know all this stuff? They're business people, a lot of them, right? They're lawyers. Yeah. And they come into a full-time church ministry. They're just organizing branches and stakes and calling bishops and patriarchs and putting out problems over this part of the church and that part of the church. And so they're not, they don't know this stuff. And so the ones that do read, they come to conferences, and the last probably 3 conferences I've been to, the first people up after I finished my presentation were general authorities, shaking my hand. Oh, I loved it. I learned so many new things, and they'll sit there and tell you all the things they learned. And that's great, because we can't assume that somehow their church position entitles them to unique knowledge and knowledge. They learn it like the rest of us. They got to put in the work, right?
Yeah.
So you were talking about the difference between the 2 books. So how does this book differ from the first book?
So the first book is The Mormon Church and Blacks, a documentary history. It's their main documents that deal with Mormons and race that general authorities had produced or other people. And then deep contextual essays about why they were significant, who wrote them, the context, the reception. This book here is a deep dive. There are no documents, standalone documents. The documents are interwoven throughout the text. Mm-hmm. And it's a book that does really 3 things, I guess, if I had to stop and think about it. The first one is it places Mormon racial theology in a larger American context. So Mormons aren't the only ones trying to figure all this out, right? Catholics and mainline Protestants and others are doing this. So I wanted to contextualize the Mormon experience. The second one is I wanted to talk about theology. What is it about this theology that the church is teaching? Why do they believe it? Who's doing it? Do they all believe it? Are there some dissenters? So that was part of it. And then the third one, this is really critical, is that I wanted to capture a range of voices about the band, government officials, civil rights groups, Black, brown, and white people. What are they saying? Church leaders, of course. And then most critically, as I put in the introduction, I privilege Black and biracial Latter-day Saints because they have the most at stake in this story. And it was really, really important for me that I balance the scholarship of all of this and those first 2 points I made with personal stories, particularly from Black saints. And
it makes it more of a living history. It makes it more real.
It does make it real. And that's why I mentioned a minute ago to you guys that I'm getting messages every day from Black and biracial Latter-day Saints. I mean, Summerrain, you just mentioned it. It's triggering, right?
Yeah.
And just give you one example. In 2004, so this is not long ago, 2004, there's an African-American woman in the church, and she's a model and an actress, and the church invited her to, and her family, she's got biracial children, white husband. They invited the mom or the family to be on a cover photo shoot for some LDS church magazine. And so the woman, good LDS woman, she agreed. She shows up and there's a black man there waiting. And she didn't think anything of it. And anyway, they just said, well, we're going to have this black man stand in for your white husband. She's like, what? And clearly they're not comfortable with interracial marriage. This is the 21st century. You'd think we were talking about 1922.
Yeah.
And so clearly this woman protested and said, look, if you're going to eulogize my family like this, I'm not going to do this. This is my husband, not that guy, this guy. So when I read that story, this is in my book, but I wanted people to see that these racist impulses lingered well into the 21st century. And the three of us, we've all lived through it like a lot of Latter-day Saints. And so I wanted people to connect to these stories. And I also wanted to let people know it wasn't just black and biracial people who suffered. They suffered the most, no doubt. But brown and white Latter-day Saints they grew up in the church conditioned to see black and biracial people as inferior.
Yeah.
That God had a favored lineage. He had a racialized hierarchy.
I was talking with somebody who he was looking through my book, I guess, and he said that he has a brother-in-law that still believes that the African Americans are, less than. They're not.
Yeah.
Like the church only changed to get a little social bump, in the rest of the world's eyes, not because that doctrinally they're equal to the whites or something like that. And it's hard to believe. It's 2024 and somebody would still have an attitude like that.
I will say that I appreciate that the most in this book is, instead of saying, I don't know where it came from, I don't know where these bigotry, views came from, it must have been the culture or the members. I appreciate that there is a line of where it came from. And so you can understand why culture is the way that it is in certain parts to this day within the church. And it's not all the fault of the member, right? If they're being told pioneer stories along with, the curse of Cain stories, this is going through from generations to generations. And so there's a healing process that needs to happen. I think it's important to not just say it's the members, so the members need to figure it out. It came from leadership at some point, and we need to acknowledge that so that members now can rectify that and say, okay, now I know where it is and it was wrong. So we can move forward now.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's the members are taking their cues from their church leaders and also the larger American society. I mean, people, not to single out our brothers and sisters in the South, but, in the 1940s and 50s, Latter-day Saints in the South, they have two whammies, right? One is they have a church theology that has conditioned them to see black and biracial people as less than the sum of their parts. And then you've got a Southern culture of bigotry and racism and lynching and the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, that's all weighing part of it. And so when you take that cultural element and then you take the religious element, it creates a toxic environment. And I've always told people, if you want to undo this, including the person, Gene, that you just mentioned, if you want to do better, you've got to educate yourself. Yeah. You've got to make friends with black and biracial people. Listen to them. Keep your mouth shut and just listen to them, their stories. And their stories over time become more legitimizing. And you are less likely to have these racist views if you know people's experiences. I can't tell you how many times I do this with immigration when we demonize our brothers and sisters at the border. Yeah. Why is it so hard for you to understand, Mr. So-and-so, that the people coming across the border, they want the same things that you and I want. They want housing security and food security and good schools for their kids. Why is that so hard to figure out? But yet we demonize them, right? They're rapists and drug pushers and, all that stuff. So anyway, get to know people in marginalized communities. Let me say one last thing before maybe we move on. That is, I wanted people with these stories, particularly Black and biracial Latter-day Saints, I wanted people to see how doctrine and policies impact real life people.
Mhm.
It's one thing to say, oh, here's a doctrine, here's what the saints believe, or Catholics believe, or Protestants. But the truth is that in this something we call lived religion, how doctrine impacts your life, how it makes you a better person, or maybe how it makes you bitter if you're told that you don't measure up. I wanted to capture those voices, and it's I knew a lot about this topic before I went into this book, but the psychological trauma that I've seen our Black and biracial brothers and sisters carry it was tough. Not gonna lie, it was really tough, and it's even still challenging as I hear the pain, as I mentioned, from these same groups of people today who are reaching out to me and just needing a listening ear, which I'm happy to provide.
Yeah.
That's right.
I wanted to just say something really fast, Matt, about just the scholarship that you did with this book. My father grew up in the segregated South, so he grew up during that time, and I just remember him saying that their communities were segregated, but they were very strong. And but the one thing I always knew, because it is my history, was the things like the one drop rule. I mean, that's what hinged the Jim Crow laws and all those things that were in the South. So what I really appreciated was not just telling the stories and speaking of why it, who said what, but also the larger context of America. Because I think a lot of people in 2024 can read this book and say, why was it acceptable, right? Why was the one drop rule accepted within the church when it was such bad practice across the country? But when you start to see what America was going through at the time and what other religions were going through at the time, you start to understand why certain things were more accepted, right? How the LDS faith may have grew more because of the racist practice they took into place, because it was a fabric of, I don't know if that makes sense, but appreciated understanding not just, okay, Brigham Young said this or John Taylor said that, but also what America was going through at the time and why members of the church would be more accepting of certain things. They weren't all abolitionists, right? So they would hear certain things and say, well, my neighbor who's not LDS believes this as well. So this makes sense that it would come from God, or a prophet would say it, or whatever. I don't know if I'm making sense. I don't want to start babbling, but I appreciated that American fabric part of the American history meshed in with the Mormon history to understand what was happening at the time.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That the Mormon experience is the larger American experience, right? And the American experience is, in some small part, the Mormon experience. And you see, as the country embraces things like the one drop rule and Jim Crow and interracial marriage laws, that the church is following right along too. And since you mentioned the one drop rule, I'll just say a quick thought about that. This is a rule that most scholars would pinpoint it to the 1820s and 30s. It was created on southern plantations to determine who had the drop so that you could prevent interracial intimacy, love, and sex. And that didn't happen, of course. If we all study history, we'll know that there were biracial kids running around on plantations all over the place because of sexual exploitation on the part of the master towards their slaves, their property. But it was against the law, and it was looked down upon to have these interracial encounters. And that's why they created the one drop rule. And by 1930, the US Census decided that it would classify a Negro, as they used in those days, as anyone who had one drop. And I just want to pause for your listeners to understand something really critical. This is all nonsense. There's no such thing as a one drop. We all have African and indigenous ancestry. We go back 200 years. That's not a long time, right? 10 generations, 200 years. We each have an African and indigenous ancestry. So it's been a fiction from the get-go. And most Americans and Latter-day Saints don't understand this. And this is why they come up with that harebrained idea, the one drop rule, which means that if you have 100 ancestors and one can claim lineage through Africa, then you're considered cursed. And the other thing that I think is important is that after the American Civil War, when Southerners lost the war, they're bitter, they're upset. It had just ruined their entire economy, their livelihood, their culture, you name it. And they pushed back by creating laws to define Black people, to deny them rights. And the one drop rule would be the most draconian, right? Anywhere you go back in your family line, you have one ancestor, you're considered cursed or Negro. Whereas in some states, you could go back maybe a handful of generations, and the law would say if you had 1/32nd African ancestry or 1/16th or 1/8. Now think about this. These are just lawmakers sitting around a desk in South Carolina in 1900 or Mississippi in 1894. They're trying to figure out how they're going to define a Black person. You could be considered Black in one state because it's, say, 1/8, and then you go to the next state over that has a 1/32nd definition, and you can be considered white. So race is nothing but a construct, and the church, Summerlin, to your point, or Summerrain, to your point, the church has bought into these fractions, and like the rest of the nation, they're struggling to define these racial boundaries.
Yeah.
And about when did you think that the Second Class Saints was going to be a book? When did you start working on that? I mean, it was the aftermath of the first book, but did you have a germ back then?
Oh, yeah. I always thought
Was the goal to get a second book in Deseret book? Is that what the goal was?
No, I don't. I'm still in shock from the first book. I think the second book would lead me to an early grave. Probably have a heart attack, especially if they put this book in there.
Oh yeah,
this book is pretty transparent. I've had general authorities read it already, and they write me emails. I loved it. It was great. We need that transparency, but it was hard. Some of those stories. Hard. Yeah. But anyway, so I did have two books in mind, Gene, and as any scholar and author knows, that especially a historian, when you research something, you have to resist the urge to write about everything you know. And it's some scholars might vary with me on this, but it's not implausible that you create a documentary record, your research notes, and you use maybe 20-25% of it. And there's a reason why you can't use the other 80% is because maybe the book's too long if you do, maybe it's too detailed for a general audience, maybe it's not completely pertinent to the focus that you've now decided on. And so for me, 25% of what I knew went into here, and that left 80%. And so I knew there was another book. I always wanted to do a book on modern American racial history or modern Mormon racial history, which is not talked about in the literature at all. We've got a lot of great books that deal with 19th century Mormon racial history with the ban and so forth, but not the modern era. But there's one reason for that. It's not because scholars don't know that there's a gap in the modern era. It's because it's source material. In the church archives in Salt Lake City, it's called the LDS Church History Library. The papers of modern general authorities are not open for research. So it begs the question, how did I get access to all these papers, right? I know what you're thinking. And I'm not going to tell you. No, just kidding.
No.
You have spies everywhere.
You'll have to come back tomorrow. So the short answer is relationships. So I worked a number of relationships at the church archives, people who could trust me. So I got access to a lot of collections there that are shut off and restricted. One would be the Joseph Fielding Smith papers, who's a main mover and shaker in this book. I got access to his collection that's, as far as I know, no other scholar has ever seen before. And I got access to a lot of other collections of the church archives. Some of the collections that were off limits there, that were restricted, I don't even think I asked to see them. But I found out that their children had copies that they had retained when they donated their late father's papers. I say children, these are people in their 60s and 70s, right?
Yeah.
You know, you don't look like a kid to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I interviewed with numerous kids from general authorities. And, think about this for a moment, you guys. Hi, my name is Matt Harris. Can I see your dad's diaries? It's not that easy, because I wouldn't want to give anybody my diaries, some stranger, right? I mean, because it's not just the race stuff that you're dealing with in your father's ministry. It could be private family issues. It could be marital problems. It could be any number of issues, right?
Yeah.
And so I didn't take that lightly. And I kind of make a running joke in my head, that I'm probably, I don't know, I'm 12 for 12. Of the 12 interviews I've done over the years, I've passed every one of them. They gave me the diaries. Some of them I had to work really hard.
I was going to say, or you're independently wealthy and you were able to give them a gift.
I'm a
Sufficient.
professor at a public institution, Gene, so that'll be your answer. But let me tell you about one of these relationships that I met and had to cultivate and nourish, because I don't think I could have written this book without it, but it wouldn't be nearly the book that it was if I didn't form a relationship and friendship with Ed Kimball, President Kimball's son. And when I knew that Spencer Kimball kept voluminous diaries over most of his church ministry, of course, I'm the type of researcher and scholar, I like to have it all. And I'll give you a metaphor that how I approach history is I think of it like Thanksgiving. The turkey would be the journals, the letters, the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency meeting minutes. That's the turkey. The trimmings would be an Ensign article or this or that. Now, the trimmings are important, right? You want to see what the church is publishing and saying. But I don't take on a research project unless I get the turkey. And anybody who read my stuff knows that I get access to diaries and meeting minutes, and otherwise I probably wouldn't write on it. So I went to Ed Kimball. I called him on the phone first, and we talked at least two or three occasions. He's asking me questions. What do you intend to do? And he's asking me really good questions. And then he invited me to his house in Provo, Utah in November of 2013. He lived right near the old Provo temple that they just smashed, I guess, destroyed.
Yeah.
And so he lived not far from there, beautiful home. And so I walked in, and we'd already sort of broken the ice on the phone, and he was different in terms of the interview, because Ed was a scholar himself. He had written 2 wonderful biographies of his father's presidency, and he had covered the race issue himself in some detail from his father's papers. And so he wasn't a novice with this story. And so he had that shared interest, or we had that shared interest in this story. And so I came in, we were talking. We spent probably 8 hours and shared 2 meals together. This was not planned, but we just really enjoyed each other's company. And I was bouncing ideas off him. And I would say something like, Ed, I'm going to say something that you could not say in your books of your father. Push back. Now, he's a law professor, so he's used to arguing. And I said, quarrel with me. Tell me where I'm wrong. And I said something provocative to him. And I said, your father was going to lift the ban the first day he became the president, but he couldn't do it because he had to get buy-in from the 12. And Ed
proved me wrong.
Ed's like, you are absolutely right. And Ed, of course, couldn't write that in his books because for a lot of reasons, he chose to publish his desperate book, and it would upset the church narrative too much.
Absolutely.
And I ran a bunch of other ideas by him. And finally, so the arrangement was, it turns out he didn't have the diaries at the house, which was shocking to me. He had donated them to the church history archives, and typically they give you copies of the diaries. At least now they do. Back in the day they didn't, but they would say to the family, we'll give you a digital copy of your father's diaries, but we want the originals. So it turns out Ed did get a digital copy, or one of his kids has a digital copy, but he didn't. So the originals were in Salt Lake, and he said, I will make sure that you get access to everything you need.
Wow.
And I was really excited about that. So when I left that day, Ed was kind of thinking about something, and I could tell there was something on his mind as I was leaving. And It was probably maybe for about 3 or 4 seconds. And then he reached down next to his chair, kind of under his chair, this cache of documents that were hidden. And he said, I want you to have these. I could not write these in my book. And I did not give these to the church archives when I donated my father's papers, but I want you to have them and incorporate them in your book. And so the documents he gave me appear in chapter 8 of my book. And the reason why that he didn't include them in his book, and the reason why he wanted me to have them, is because it was an important part of the story that is controversial. He didn't feel like he could tell, but being an honest and open scholar that he was, he felt that the church needed to hear it. And it deals with Elder McConkie and Elder Packer embellishing the revelation. Jesus showed up, angels showed up, past presidents showed up. And his father, so Ed Kimball's father, President Kimball, rebuked him. Don't tell people, he told Elder McConkie, that we heard a voice. We didn't hear a voice. We didn't see angels or visions. The revelation came about by the still small voice telling us that we needed to make this change. And that's how we want the revelation to be told and taught to the church. And so one can see why that's controversial and sensitive. And so I told Ed, I said, I will absolutely do my very best to be careful with this story, to be sensitive to it, to try to put it in the right light. And, I'll let readers judge for themselves if I succeeded.
That's right. Ed Kimball, actually, I've never met him, but I have a special place in my heart for him because he appeared on Mormon Stories right about 2013, I think. And he talked about what it was like to be the son of a prophet. Where else can you get that?
Yeah.
Right? What other show has a child of a prophet talking for hours? Of course, it was Mormon Stories, John DeLynn. It was hours. And it was fascinating. It was like there's a phone call, and that's the call that his dad gets to become an apostle, right?
Yeah.
And just reliving that through him telling the story was fascinating. And also, after I had heard Darius Gray talk at the Oakland Interstate Center, that made me more interested. Ed's second book, Lengthen Your Stride, had a chapter on Blacks in the priesthood. And the book has about 13 pages. But in the back, there's a CD that has another 20, 25 pages on that material. And that's where I learned that the progression, right? It was like in the 40s, it was the one drop. In the 50s, it was 4 generations. In the 60s, it was don't ask, don't tell, basically. And then it made me feel that Spencer W. Kimball was courageous, right? He went for 2 weeks to the temple every day, prayed. And I felt, reading between the lines, that Spencer Kimball was saying, God, I'm going to give the blacks the priesthood. I'm old. I've had heart operations. If this is not your will, take me, right? And to me, like, offered his life at the altar. And when he was still alive 2 weeks later, he felt that was his answer, that he should go ahead and do it. That was, very important and meaningful to me, when I would see that story. And we'll provide a link to the Mormon Stories. And you've been on Mormon Stories a few times. And so Mormon Stories is doing a series on this book that's going to be very important. We'll link your first appearance in that series, and people can go find out more.
And I want to thank the sources like Ed, that the ones that are named and not named, that helped you with this book, because it takes a lot of courage, not just to shake things up narrative wise, but also there are legacies involved, and these are their parents or their grandparents, and they, you don't want, I don't want to talk badly about my parents. And so to get a hold of my father's diary during times that were very controversial, that may not fit the narrative that is being told now, it takes a lot of courage to say, I want truth to prevail, and let the chips fall where they may. So I just want to give a shout out to those sources, and a shout out to you for being so confidential, that they trust you. Because I know no one would trust me with their diary, including my own sister. And so for people that you don't know, to say, let me give you my diary, or diary of a family member because I trust that you will do good by it, but also you won't, give things that don't need to be told, is a
Right.
testament to you. So I do want to give you a shout out for that as well.
Right.
Thank you, Maureen. I appreciate that. I've been doing lots of publicity the last few weeks on this book, and the Salt Lake Tribune interviewed me around the time of the priesthood anniversary revelation, so January 8th, 9th, in that area. And they asked me some questions about the revelation and some of the events leading up to it. And one of the people who commented was one of Spencer Kimball's grandsons, who's a friend of mine. And he said, for whatever it's worth, Matt, I think you told the story the way that my grandfather wanted it told. And I thought, man, that means a lot, because I'm trying to be as accurate as I can. I'm trying to be as sensitive as I can. And as a historian, I'm trying to be as transparent as I can too. I tell people this is a tough subject. I don't sugarcoat. There are no artificial preservatives and sweeteners. What you see is what there is. I'm always trying to be balanced and sensitive, but the hardest thing for me to do is to get conservative Latter-day Saints to read this book, because they have this mistaken idea that President Kimball just showed up in the temple on June 1st and had a revelation and would be done with it. And really what I have to explain to them is the revelation is a process. It's not an event.
Yeah.
And the process is getting your colleagues in the highest quorums of the church to agree to make a change. That's what the Doctrine and Covenants says. It's about consensus. But you can't get a consensus just by kneeling down and saying a prayer. It doesn't usually work that way. You have to work with them, resolve their concerns. It's very practical, right? And that's why President Kimball's leadership, in my opinion, is so remarkable, is because there were a lot of people in the Quorum of the 12 with these very intense views on race, and they did not see a place for Black men in the priesthood or Black families in temples. But President Kimball knew that if you didn't lift this ban, the church couldn't fulfill its purpose to globalize. If you can't go into sub-Saharan Africa, how in the world can you think that you're spreading the gospel to every kindred, nation, tongue, and people if a chunk of the world is shut off?
And they were about to build a temple in Brazil, and almost everybody in Brazil has a touch of African blood, for sure.
Oh my goodness! And you know what's interesting, Gene, is Spencer Kimball knows this. He writes about this in his diary. I don't know how we're going to do this. Everybody has, like you said, African blood or Negro blood, as he writes in those days. Mm-hmm. Everybody has Negro blood. And to his genius, to President Kimball's genius, is that he recognizes that the path to the priesthood goes through Brazil. And he uses that temple as leverage to convince the hardliners that this is what God wants. And to me, that's just incredible, remarkable leadership.
That's right. And we were talking about source material. And we were talking about Spencer Kimball. And one thing that stood out to me is on page 58, you have something that happened prior to the revelation in, I don't know if it's the late 50s or early 60s. There were committees that would discuss what they should do. What should our tact be? How should we do things? And I know other places they were talking about like a junior priesthood for the African descendants and other things. And one thing that stood out to me that Kimball wrote in all caps in the cover of the minutes of a meeting: to my family and many and others, under no circumstances, none, are these papers and this book and all excerpts from this minutes of this meetings of the brethren in the temple or otherwise to be appropriated for the library or office or possession of any of family, friends, or others. These are totally personal and private and must be turned in total to the brethren, the first presidency of the church or council of the 12. No deletions, no copies, no Xerox, or anything like unto it. I have pledged to myself that I would hold all these papers inviolate. So, did you read what happened after that? Bold caps.
Well, it's that. So that statement is in reference to a committee that President McKay had formed in the spring of 1954. He had just returned from South Africa and Brazil. Those are the two countries that pose fits for the church. And so when they went into those two countries, they were in South Africa in 1904, and then they moved into Brazil in 1929. And they knew that, of course, then that there was African ancestry in those two countries. Of course, this is South Africa, folks, right? So, duh. And then, of course, Brazil, which has a long history of slavery and race mixing. Slavery was the last country in the Western world to get rid of slavery, 1888.
Yeah.
So they don't abolish slavery until after, the American Civil War. So they're aware of this, and so they target places in the country that are known or thought to be known to be populated by white people. Now, we've talked a minute ago about that's fiction from the get-go. We all have African and indigenous ancestry, but they're doing the best that they can. So they're trying to just target the white population, and the policy of the missions was to avoid the policies that could have African lineage. So in Brazil, for example, it was the southern part of the country where Germans had moved there, and their ethnic origins were certain, so you could proselytize to the Germans. But in northern Brazil, off limits, because that was a Black African region.
That's right. The first Book of Mormon in Brazil was a German language edition.
Right. So that's what they're doing. And of course, this all gets complicated, particularly when people from northern Brazil start to move into southern Brazil, and like, whoops. So you can't keep it that neat and tidy. Well, McKay gets back from these two countries, and he realizes that it's a disaster, that they're baptizing and conferring priesthood ordination on persons of African ancestry. He knows this. And it's the light-skinned people, the biracial, as we would say today. They call them mulattoes in those days, which is a terrible term if you look up the meaning. But biracial Latter-day Saints. And so they're the ones that are sliding below the color line. They're getting ordained to the priesthood, even though they have known African ancestry, because they look white.
They're race passing, I think is what
Yep. They're flouting the church's racial markers. And this is going on all over the world in the mid-20th century. So it's not just the church, it's just happening everywhere.
Wow.
So anyway, so President McKay comes back from South Africa in Brazil in the spring of 54, and he convenes this meeting by a liberal apostle named Adam Benyon. And Adam Benyon he didn't like the ban. He didn't like it at all. And so he chairs the committee that will look into the feasibility of overturning the ban. Now, I'm going to say that again. He'll chair a committee, this apostle, to look into the possibility of overturning the ban. This is 1954. This is, we're still 28 years out from the time that it actually happens. So anyway, it's in that context that you see those all caps, Gene, that you just read. That's Spencer Kimball. He got a hold of the meeting minutes of the committee. And what he's saying in that caption was that when he dies, that his private papers that would be bequeathed to his family, that they're supposed to go to the first presidency in the Quorum of the 12. That his family, they're not supposed to make Xerox copies. They're not supposed to, scan them and put them on the internet. They're supposed to go right to the brethren in Salt Lake. And he was worried about it because all of those there were meeting minutes from the brethren, and these are supposed to be private and confidential, and they're not supposed to be known. So guys like me can now share them.
Yeah. So I had a question too about because when I was growing up, I grew up on the East Coast as well. I grew up in New York and then Pennsylvania area. I grew up the same thing. They didn't know where the band came from. I was also taught it was a priesthood band, had no idea that it was a temple ordinance band. So those are things I learned in the essay when I read it in 2022. But I also had always been told it was unanimous. Everybody was on board. And then I learned about, Elder Peterson and his views. And so did you want to talk a little bit about how you saw President Kimball kind of working with, like you were saying earlier, the hardliners, but also people like Elder Peterson, who was a little bit further than even a hard line. There wasn't a line. It was just a no.
Boy, it's hard for some saints. I've talked to a lot of Latter-day Saints over the years about the church's race theology, and I've written dozens of articles too on various topics. And so I've been thinking about race for a long time. And it's hard for people to understand that there's a gradation among the church leaders. They're not all really hard-crusted hardliners. They're just not. And I was struck when I read Spencer Kimball's papers and David O. McKay's diaries for the first time. They never mentioned Black people being cursed. I thought, that's interesting. So I reached out to Ed Kimball and I just said, Ed, I just read the diaries. Your dad doesn't talk about Black people being cursed. He's like, yeah, because he didn't believe it. But he did buy into the less valiant line, but he didn't believe in the curse line. And I reached out to one of my good friends who's done a lot of work on David O. McKay. And I said, okay, I've read hundreds, maybe thousands of pages now of his diaries and all of that. I don't see any instance where President McKay thought Black people were cursed. Same thing. Nope, doesn't believe it.
Wow.
So Joseph Fielding Smith, Mark Peterson, Summer Rain are different. Harold Lee, they're really, really hardcore. And when Spencer Kimball in the spring of 1978, he had agreed earlier, many years earlier, to lift the ban, but he had to get buy-in from the quorum. I think your listeners need to understand something that's really important. If the church president could wave his wand and say, hey guys, we're going to lift the ban. We're just going to do it because I'm the prophet. But that's not how it works. Spencer Kimball had seen from church history what happens when a president or a prophet unilaterally makes a decision that not everybody's on board with. We saw it happen in 1890 when Wilford Woodruff proclaimed a revelation saying that God wants us to suspend the ban or the polygamy. And it split the quorum of the 12 down the middle. And half the quorum left the church. Some of them got excommunicated. And then it led to a massive schismatic movement in the church where we call them fundamentalists today. But they left the mainstream church because they thought God was telling them to practice polygamy when Wilford Woodruff was saying that's no longer what we're going to do. So Kimball knew this. And if you're going to make something as momentous a change as allowing the priesthood ordination to this group that had been cut off or shut off for many years, that you needed to have buy-in. He never could get buy-in from Mark Peterson, Ezra Taft Benson, and Delbert Stapley. And Ed Kimball was very clear on all of this with me. That's one of the things we talked about for 8 hours was, what did your dad do to win these three over? And how come he didn't succeed? And, this is all stuff Ed couldn't write in his book, of course. But so what Spencer Kimball did was he was an absolute genius at leading to changes when he couldn't get the consensus. Remember, Doctrine and Covenants, section 107 says it has to be unanimous. But what do you do if what do you do if you're the church president and you can't get everybody to buy in? But yet you know that the church needs to make this new doctrine or policy change to move the church forward. So what Spencer Kimball would do, in my opinion, I think it's genius, but maybe others might not. But what he would do is he would call them on church assignments, the ones that didn't agree with whatever policy change was there. And then he would have a quorum, which would be, in this case, 8? 8 would give him the quorum he needed. And the 2 or 3 or 4 dissenters would be off on church assignments around the world. And he would simply make the change while they were gone. And, your father's in politics, Summer Rain. I mean, this is like much like you would see on the floor of the Congress or the Senate, right? You would count up votes. Yeah. And so President Kimball, he didn't have a party whip, but he would count the votes. How many people support this change? And he would find out the ones who did. And when they supported it, and the ones who didn't, they would be away on church assignment. And the ones that supported it would be there in Salt Lake. They would vote. And he could then call the guys away and say, hey, we voted. It was unanimous.
Sign this paper, please, when you get back. Saying that we're all in agreement.
And I have some general authority oral histories. They talk about this. Mm-hmm. And when I read these oral histories, I thought, doggone it, that's exactly what he did with the priesthood revelation. He couldn't win over Del Stapley, Mark Peterson, so they were gone. And there was one person the day of the revelation that he couldn't win over. And it was Ezra Taft Benson.
Wow.
And Ezra Taft Benson had a long history of saying demeaning things about African Americans, including calling them the seed of Cain, including calling supporters of civil rights, saying that they were communist in line with the Kremlin and the Soviet Union. I mean, just not good. If you're trying to proselytize the world and bring the gospel to the world, you can't be demonizing people who want the right to vote and who want to job and to be free of discrimination in housing. You know, these are the things that the civil rights movement's after, and the senior apostles denigrating all this by calling them communists. And so he wasn't favorable towards Black priesthood ordination. And when President Kimball, he'd been trying for months prior to June of 1978 to get them all to agree with it. He didn't succeed. On June 1st, he made up his mind. Del Stapley was in the hospital, so he wasn't available. Mark Peterson was in Ecuador on church assignment. That was by design, as I mentioned. And now Benson was there. And when President Kimball broached the idea that they were going to lift the ban, he made a motion to table the discussion, didn't want to talk about it. And President Kimball, being the leader that he was, he said, "We're going to talk about it, Elder Benson." What he meant by that was, we're doing it today. We've been doing this for a long time. He tried in March, and it didn't work. And anyway, he'd been trying for a long time, and they didn't agree to it. So finally, he won them all over, except for Benson and the two others out of town. And it was Elder McConkie, who was the church's most significant doctrinal authority. He's the one that President Kimball targeted first among the 12. And in March of 1977, so this is a full year out before the ban's lifted, President Kimball targets Elder McConkie, who had written all of these horrible things about Black people in his book, Mormon Doctrine. And President Kimball knew that if he couldn't win over the church's foremost doctrinal authority, nothing else would matter. And President Kimball knew that what Elder McConkie said mattered. Kimball knew that, and the brethren knew it. And so on June 1st, 1978, when Ezra Taft Benson voted to table the discussion, Elder McConkie came to his defense. And I'm going to use the word lecture because that's what Elder McConkie did, but yes. Elder McConkie lectured the brethren for 10 minutes about why the ban had to end. And he was really talking to Benson. The others had come on board at that point. And what he said was, he was repeating all the talking points that President Kimball had been talking and sharing with the brethren. And one was that Jesus can't come again. The second coming can't occur until the gospel is preached to every kindred, nation, tongue, and people. That includes sub-Saharan Africa. So he gave this great oration on the need to preach the gospel to majority Black and biracial countries in preparation for the end times. He also said that there is no scriptural impediments to lifting the ban, which is shocking because if you read Mormon doctrine, it's full of scriptural impediments. So he changes himself. He reverses himself, which is to his credit. And then thirdly, he brings up Brazil. It's like, brethren, we've got this new temple in Brazil. We've just laid the cornerstone on it. What do?
We won't even be able to staff it.
We won't be able to. Yeah, right.
The tithing, people are tithing and being told that they can't enter the temple, though. So yeah, there's a lot of problems.
People are donating their gold and their teeth.
Yes, all of that. And when I used to think erroneously that when I started this research that Kimball's the one that created the temple or that proposed the Sao Paulo temple. That's not true. He inherited that from his predecessor. Harold B. Lee is the one that announced the temple.
Oh.
And what Kimball did, though, was when Harold B. Lee died after an unexpected illness, he was only in presidency for a year and a half. And he died unexpectedly. He was a younger man in his early 70s, which by Mormon standards makes him a child. And President Nelson's going to be 100. Kimball became the president, and they had just broken the ground on the Sao Paulo temple, so obviously it wasn't built yet. And Kimball recognizes right away, I've got a prime opportunity to use this temple as leverage. That's one of the things he uses to win over Elder McConkie is the Brazil temple. And this is stuff that Ed Kimball had given me too off the record, stuff that his conversations he had that Elder McConkie had with his father about this issue. And it's for a historian's perspective, it's a fascinating exchange between these two senior leaders because they're talking about how to justify it. And one of the things that Elder McConkie did was, at President Kimball's insistence, he said, I need you to write new theology. We need to have a new doctrine to sustain the lifting of the ban. If you believe that Black people are cursed, we've got to figure out how to reconcile that. And so anyway, McConkie wrote this lengthy memo to the church president, and he said that we'll adopt them into the house of Israel. by adoption, they'll be able to inherit all the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are Israelite covenant lineages that Latter-day Saints associate with the temple today.
Right.
And later on, as I point out in my book, that it's incredibly offensive to think that you're adopted, that you don't have this blood in you to begin with, like white people do.
But it also goes to, what is it, Jacob 5, the allegory, right? So it kind of helps with the Mormon theology to say, well, we're just going to graft these people in. So doctrinally, I guess it helped it go over a little bit better with Bruce R. McConkie.
Yeah, I mean, that became the church's position, that you could adopt Black people into the house of Israel and Black and biracial people in the house of Israel. But what I point out in my book is this is new doctrine, because in 1972, just before Spencer Kimball became the president, he wrote the first presidency himself, and he said, hey, is it the doctrine of the church? Can we adopt Black people into the house of Israel? And Harold B. Lee and his administration wrote Spencer Kimball back and said, no, this is not the doctrine of the church. And then 2 years later, when Kimball's the president, McConkie turns all this up on its head. And as I tell people, that's the genius of modern day revelation and new prophets, right? With a new sheriff in town, I don't mean to be flippant, but with a new leader in town, you can change the doctrine. And that's exactly what Spencer Kimball allowed Elder McConkie to do.
That's right.
Fascinating.
We probably should wrap up. Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks, Summer. And one last thing is, we talked a little bit about earlier, but at the top of your book, it says Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality.
Yep.
And like we mentioned, there's generational trauma. There are still situations where there's not equality. I was explaining that to somebody the other day, a couple of years ago, and they said, oh no, there's the African descended, members of the church. They love the church. In fact, I'm attending the 4th annual, whatever it was, that welcomed, African descendants into the church, or whatever it was called. And I said, just think, that's just the 4th anniversary.
Wow.
Yeah.
And slavery was 150 years ago or more. Right? So we all need to work hard and work together. And this book does go a long way to healing. That's what the gospel says, right? If you're going to repent, you have to make good, right? You have to go and tell people that, you're sorry. In a way, if not, you're not saying that you're sorry, Matt, but you're showing.
That's speaking for the church.
That there's something.
No.
Too kind.
There's something that the church should be sorry for. And even if the word apology is not in the scriptures anywhere, we could gently remind the church that that's what the repentance process includes, is making amends and apologizing and doing your best to do better as you move forward.
And the first step is admonishing. And I appreciate that the church has come out and said, these are not our practices and we do not follow these practices. So even if there hasn't been a strict apology, I'm very appreciative that at least people in nowadays cannot say, no, the church still believes this. It's been admonished on the top levels.
Oh, amen. The other thing is, since I'm just a big passionate supporter of racial justice, I teach civil rights, I'm knee deep in this hard work. And I appreciate that Russell Nelson in particular has formed a relationship with the NAACP. And for people who do not understand LDS church history and the adversarial relationship the NAACP and the church had back in the 60s and into the 70s and into the 80s, to think that a church president could form friendships and give church resources to help out the Black community and to invest funds into racial justice causes, that's extraordinary. And it needs to be praised. And in fact, last year, the NAACP gave President Nelson one of their highest awards.
The Nelson Mandela Award, I believe it was. Yeah.
Speaks for itself. And some Latter-day Saints I've talked to, and people can decide if they think whatever they want to decide for themselves, but they argue that President Nelson and the church's outreach to the Black community vis-a-vis the NAACP is That's an apology.
Yeah.
I'll let your listeners decide what they think about that. But President Nelson's letting the actions speak louder than words, maybe.
There you go. Well, thanks a lot. And everybody, if you like this content, like and subscribe. Everybody have a great summer. Bye-bye.